Hello and welcome. You're watching Westferry Times.
Hello?
Today we're diving into, well, a really significant and, let's face it, often complex topic. The UK's response to the refugee crisis.
Hmm.
It generates so much discussion, so much heat sometimes. And to help us sort of cut through the noise, understand the core issues, we're very pleased to have Dr. Adam Malik with us. He's a professor of international human rights at the University of Edinburgh. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So our mission today really is to extract the most important aspects of the UK's response, clarify some key ideas, some policies based on the material we've looked at.
Right.
When we talk about the UK's response, it's, easy to get lost. What are we fundamentally addressing here? What defines this refugee crisis in the UK context now?
That's the crucial starting point. While the term itself, it gained a lot of prominence around events like the Syrian civil war.
Right, 2015, around then?
Exactly. The underlying reality is about people being forced to flee their homes because of conflict. Persecution may be based on ethnicity, religion, political views, and actually increasingly environmental factors too.
Okay.
For the UK, specifically that period, 2015-2016, with the sort of wider European migration flows, that really brought it into sharp focus. And it got tangled up, didn't it, with debates about national identity and, of course, Brexit.
Yeah, definitely tangled. And it feels like one of the first things we need to grasp, maybe, is the difference between a refugee and someone who migrates for, say, economic reasons. Could you break that down a bit?
Absolutely. And this distinction is, well, it's vital, but it often gets blurred in public discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Refugees have a very specific legal definition. It's under the 1951 Refugee Convention.
Yeah.
They get international protection because they have a well-founded fear of persecution back home.
Persecution for specific reasons.
Yes, things like their race, religion, nationality, maybe belonging to a particular social group or their political opinions. Economic migrants, on the other hand, while they're also often seeking a better life, sure, they're primarily moving for, improved economic opportunities. They don't meet that specific legal definition of a refugee.
Okay.
And that difference really dictates the legal processes, the rights they're entitled to.
Yeah.
It's quite fundamental.
Right. Okay. So with that clear, let's look at what the UK has actually done. How has it responded? We often hear this phrase, a proud history of offering sanctuary.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us a snapshot of the key policies, the actions, maybe in recent years?
Yeah, there is that historical narrative, you're right, about the UK providing refuge and schemes like the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme that ran between, 2015 and 2021.
Yeah, I remember that.
That's an example of it in practice. It brought around 20,000 Syrian refugees to the UK.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, a more traditional resettlement approach.
Mm-hmm.
However, alongside those kinds of efforts, particularly more recently, we've definitely seen a noticeable shift, towards more restrictive policies when it comes to asylum.
And a lot of that shift seems tied up in the Nationality and Borders Act of 2022. That generated a huge amount of discussion.
It really did, yeah. The Nationality and Borders Act, it represents a pretty significant change in the UK's approach.
How so? What are the main parts?
Well, one of the most debated aspects is how it creates this two-tiered system for assessing asylum claims. It's based on how someone arrives in the UK.
Okay, how they get here matters.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
It tries to distinguish between those who arrive through what the Act calls irregular means, like crossing the English Channel in small boats, and those who arrive through, pre-approved official routes.
Which leads to?
This has led to the idea of Group 1 and Group 2 refugees. And the implication is that those arriving irregularly, they might face more limited rights, a shorter stay perhaps, and critically, a greater chance of their claims just being deemed inadmissible altogether.
Even if they are refugees under the convention.
Exactly. Even if they would otherwise meet the criteria for refugee status under the 1951 convention. And, many legal experts, human rights organizations, they argue this goes right against the basic principles of international refugee law.
Because the law doesn't care how you arrive.
Precisely. The convention doesn't specify how a refugee must arrive to seek protection. It focuses on the fear of persecution.
Which brings us almost inevitably to the partnership with Rwanda, another policy that's sparked huge debate. What's the basic idea there, and why all the criticism?
Right, the Rwanda Plan.
Yeah.
Officially, the Migration and Economic Development Partnership, announced back in 2022. The proposal is to transfer individuals who arrive in the UK through these so-called irregular channels to Rwanda.
For processing.
Yes, their asylum claims would actually be processed in Rwanda. And if they're successful, they'd be granted refugee status there in Rwanda and expected to build their lives there, not in the UK.
Okay. And the criticism.
Oh, it's drawn widespread criticism. From the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, various human rights organizations, legal scholars, concerns really center on the ethics, of outsourcing asylum processing like this, sending people to a country with its own documented human rights challenges.
Potentially putting vulnerable people at further risk.
That's the fear.
Right.
And then there are significant legal questions about whether the plan is even compatible with international law and domestic UK law, too, despite all the legal challenges which have so far prevented any flights.
Right. No one has actually been sent yet.
No. But the UK government maintains its commitment to it. They argue it's a key deterrent, a deterrent to irregular migration.
Deterrence. That word comes up a lot, doesn't it? It seems to be a major driver behind these more restrictive policies. But what does the evidence actually say? Do measures like this really stop people who are genuinely fleeing danger?
That is the critical question, isn't it? While the stated goal, the rationale given for policies like the Rwanda plan, is to deter these irregular crossings and disrupt human trafficking networks.
Which sounds reasonable on the surface.
Yes, but there's actually very little concrete evidence suggesting that these kinds of deterrence measures are truly effective, especially not for individuals who are facing serious threats and simply lack safe, legal alternatives to get to safety.
So people fleeing persecution.
They're often in incredibly desperate situations. The dangerous journeys they undertake, frankly, they highlight the lack of other options. Introducing more punitive measures or the threat of being sent somewhere else entirely, it's unlikely to deter someone who feels they have absolutely no other choice but to risk everything for safety.
Could it make things worse?
It could. It might even push them towards even more dangerous hidden routes and make them more reliant on ruthless smugglers and traffickers.
So if we look beyond the politics, the rhetoric, what are the actual impacts on the people seeking safety here? What are the human costs involved in these policies?
Oh, the human impact is it's really significant. You have lengthy delays in processing asylum claims. For a start, these are compounded by increasing complexity in the system, huge backlogs. It leaves people in limbo.
Just waiting.
Waiting.
Yeah.
Experiencing prolonged uncertainty, anxiety. Many asylum seekers face destitution, really struggling to meet basic needs while they wait sometimes for years for a decision.
And the environment they're waiting in?
Well, the language used around irregular arrivals, the implementation or threatened implementation of policies like the Rwanda plan,
Yeah.
it can all contribute to what's often called a hostile environment.
Mm-hmm.
This might lead to increased discrimination, even hate incidents against refugees and asylum seekers. And furthermore, the conditions in some of the temporary accommodation, like hotels or former military sites, they've been heavily criticized as unsuitable, particularly for people who've often experienced significant trauma.
So a psychological toll, too.
Absolutely. The psychological toll of these policies, the constant uncertainty, the feeling of being unwanted, it really cannot be overstated.
It does paint a really concerning picture. How much do you think public opinion and maybe the way the media portrays all this shapes the political landscape around the UK's response?
Public opinion is definitely a major factor, but it's a complex picture, not straightforward. Surveys often show a divided public.
How so?
Well, you see many people expressing empathy for those fleeing persecution, supporting the idea of safe routes. But then others have genuine concerns about overall immigration levels, the impact on public services, that kind of thing.
And the media's role.
Unfortunately, sensationalized media coverage, the kind that uses dehumanizing language, focuses on narratives of like invasion or swarms, that can heavily influence public perception.
Yeah, that language is powerful.
Incredibly powerful. It can really contribute to negative attitudes towards refugees and asylum seekers. The language used, both in political discourse and in media reports, it can either foster understanding and empathy, or it can fuel prejudice and division. A balanced, factual portrayal is just crucial for any kind of informed public debate.
Taking a step back, looking at the bigger picture, how does the UK's approach, the scale of its response, actually compare with other developed nations facing similar challenges?
It's a really important comparison to make. When you look at the actual numbers, the statistics, the UK receives fewer asylum applications per capita, so relative to its population size, than many other European countries.
Fewer than Germany or France?
Yes, fewer than Germany, France, and even some smaller nations like Sweden, actually. While the UK government often highlights its resettlement schemes, like the Syrian one we mentioned, The numbers of refugees resettled through those specific schemes are often relatively limited when you compare them to the overall global need, or even what some other countries manage through various means.
And policy choices differ too.
Oh, definitely. It's important to note the different policy choices other countries make. Some, for instance, prioritize more efficient asylum processing, trying to get decisions made faster. Others invest more heavily in integration programs from the start, and some place a greater emphasis on international cooperation, burden sharing across Europe or globally.
So the perception might not match reality.
The perception that the UK is somehow uniquely overwhelmed often doesn't really align with the statistical reality of the number of asylum applications it receives compared to many other developed nations.
Okay. So if you were advising policymakers right now, given everything we've discussed,
Yep.
what would be your key recommendations for a more, I suppose, effective and humane way forward?
Well, based on the evidence and thinking about fundamental human rights principles, I'd suggest a few key things, a multifaceted approach, really.
Okay, like what?
Firstly, significantly expanding safe and legal routes for people to seek asylum is crucial, absolutely
To
crucial.
avoid the dangerous journeys.
Exactly. That would reduce reliance on dangerous, irregular journeys and allow for a more managed, orderly system. This could mean things like increasing resettlement quotas, making it easier for families to reunite, perhaps offering humanitarian visas in certain situations.
Makes sense. What else?
Secondly, dramatically speeding up the asylum processing system.
Yeah.
It's essential. The current delays cause immense suffering and uncertainty, as we've said. Investing in efficient, properly resourced decision-making processes isn't just more humane, it's probably more cost-effective in the long run, too.
Right. Avoiding long stays in temporary accommodation.
Precisely. Thirdly, I would strongly advise against pursuing punitive and frankly ethically problematic policies like the Rwanda Plan. They've been widely criticized by experts, by international bodies, and crucially, they haven't actually demonstrated effectiveness as a deterrent.
So instead of that,
Instead, the focus really should shift towards addressing the root causes of displacement conflict, persecution, instability, through things like international collaboration, diplomacy, development aid.
and finally,
Finally, investing properly in comprehensive integration programs. That's vital to ensure that refugees who are granted protection can actually rebuild their lives, contribute to their new communities, and foster social cohesion.
and that point about integration, it feels so important. Refugees often arrive with skills, experiences. They can enrich society, can't they, if given the chance?
Absolutely. That's often overlooked. Refugees are individuals.
Mm.
They have diverse skills, talents, experiences. With the right support, things like language training, access to education, help finding employment, creating inclusive social environments, they can make really significant positive contributions, economically, socially, culturally. It benefits both the refugees and the host communities.
We have certainly covered a lot of ground today. As we sort of draw this deep dive to a close, what are your final thoughts on where the UK stands right now with its approach?
My final thought is really that the UK faces a critical choice. It seems to be at a crossroads. It can continue down this path of increasingly restrictive policies that, in my view and the view of many experts, appear to prioritize deterrence over the fundamental right to seek asylum.
Or the alternative.
Or it can choose a different path, a more compassionate, more legally sound approach, one that genuinely upholds its international obligations under the Refugee Convention and, perhaps more fundamentally, recognizes our shared humanity with those forced to seek safety. You know, the world is watching how the UK, with its often cited long tradition of offering refuge, responds to this ongoing global challenge.
Dr. Adam Malik, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insights with us today here on Westferry Times. It's been incredibly helpful, I think, in providing a much clearer understanding of these really complex issues.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And to all of you watching Westferry Times, if you found this deep dive informative, and I certainly did, please do give this video a like. Maybe share it with friends and family who might be interested. And please don't forget to subscribe to Westferry Times for more in-depth discussions on important issues like this one. We'll be back with another topic very soon. Until then, stay informed. Goodbye for now.